that chatbot held 2.3 million conversations with customers and is now saving them a $40 million annual run rate.
That's crazy.
Innovation in law is quite different from automation. The most important part of that policy was that lawyers got fee relief.
Do you think this hype will carry on?
Today's episode is sponsored by VXT, the phone system built for law firms. VXT integrates with practice management systems so that when lawyers make calls, their billable time and legal advice can be saved in the right place automatically. 20% of billable time goes unrecorded. A lot of that is phone calls that get forgotten about. Get some of those billables back using VXT. Go to vxt.co.nz or click the link in the description to find out more.
So welcome to the podcast, Sam. It's great to have you here for what I think will be a fascinating and practical conversation about yourself, but also on the topic of AI, its use cases, and of course, the risks.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really looking forward to talking with you, a topic I'm very interested and passionate about.
Great. So currently your role is the AI lead at Minter Ellison, one of the largest law firms in Australia. And that role is probably one that didn't exist when you were dreaming of what you wanted to be when you were growing up. So can you share what your background is that led you to this role?
Yeah, and really grateful and fortunate to be working in a really large and innovative law firm at this juncture where AI and generative AI in particular of such interest to our clients and to our people. I didn't think I'd ever have a job quite like this. When I was studying law at university, I remember reading Richard Suskind's book, Tomorrow's Lawyers, which had a number of bold predictions about what the future of legal practice would look like. And at the time, I was very interested in business. I was very interested in innovation and doing things differently. And that book really struck a chord with me. And when I graduated, I was really keen to look at opportunities to do law differently. And one of the first places I worked was at a firm called Legal Vision in Australia, who truly were really innovative, technology-driven, and very much ahead of their time in the work that they were doing. So I was really fortunate to work there, and that gave me an understanding of different ways of working, different ways that we could service our clients as lawyers. That was my first sort of exposure to doing things differently in law. I'd also had a background in running a group personal training gym with my best mate, who is now also a lawyer. And that sort of opened my eyes to what it's like to own and run a business and to think, and approach the law in terms of a business, which is a little bit different to how a lot of people traditionally and how we traditionally think about legal practice. So with those two things, those two experiences really shaped my career path in law, and it's been a long and winding journey. But as of the last 6 to 12 months, it has increasingly focused on artificial intelligence. And there's a number of reasons for that, not least because Minter Ellison has been really leading the way in terms of developing AI tools for our people and collaborating with clients on that, as well as advising really large organizations on the risks associated with AI and risk management. I'm happy to dive into it further, but that's the very broad contour. It's been a long and winding journey and lots of luck along the way.
Yeah. And so when you were reading that book back at university and there were some bold predictions about what the future of law might look like, was there any that stood out to you that you can still remember today?
Because I was running the gym, the business at the time that I was studying and reading this book, one of the things that really stood out to me that Suskind said at the time, he's been saying this for 20 or 30 years now, is that innovation in law is quite different from automation. We tend to think about digitizing or automating legal work in terms of doing what we do now, but digitally or faster. But innovation is actually something quite different. It's about thinking about the work that we do, breaking it down into different components. He calls it disaggregation. And then identifying ways that we can do that completely differently, reimagining it. And I hadn't ever thought about innovation that way before, the difference between doing something, faster and better versus doing it completely differently. And that idea really stuck with me for a very long time. Again, go back to Legal Vision, I was fortunate to see they were doing work completely differently. They ran a subscription model for their businesses, and that really changed the way they delivered legal services. I was fortunate to work at another company called Plexus, who are building a contract management technology that, again, was changing the way that lawyers will work fundamentally. And so I've carried that idea, certainly, from Susskind all the way through the difference between automation and innovation.
Yeah. And I think because law is such a old profession, it's so easy to be stuck in the mind of this is how we do this and there's no possibility of change. So it really requires a pick up, move you to think about something completely different. Or I guess that's where the value comes of people working in the legal space that may not be a lawyer, and having those people that have a bit of a outside perspective, have done something else or studied something else.
To 20 years, the legal profession was purely made up of legal professionals, and then you had maybe paralegals and assistants. But what we're increasingly seeing is the managerialization of the profession. Sounds like a bit of a unnecessarily complicated term, but it's the idea that we are applying business processes, ideas, systems, and practices to the practice of law, and taking it away from a traditional notion of, this artisanal, individual, unique way of delivering legal services to each client each time, to identifying, look, in some areas of legal practice, it's true that it's repetitive, and we may be able to do those things differently. And so that's part of one of the main forces, this increasing managerialism in legal practice, that is creating opportunities for different people like me who want to explore different career paths, and also for our clients for delivering services differently.
And I know that you started your own podcast previously, and there you're talking to a lot of people and finding out about the different careers that might exist or be created in the legal space. Was there any other particular things that you really took away from your time doing the podcast?
Yes, I was really fortunate during that time to speak with a range of legal leaders, including really senior CEOs and lawyers from across Australia, as well as internationally as well. And I took away a number of things from that, not least sort of some really great relationships, which I keep to this day as a result of doing those interviews. But certainly for me, one of them was that at this very highest level, these people that I was interviewing were very senior, very experienced, very capable. And even back then, they were feeling that there was a lot of change happening in the legal profession. This is sort of pre-COVID. There was this swelling sense that technology, that new ways of working, that alternative legal business models were actually starting to gain momentum. And that was exciting for me at the time. Post-COVID, that absolutely accelerated with the adoption of technology. And now we're in another wave of change again with artificial intelligence. And so that early sort of hypothesis that I was developing, that in university, look, there could be different ways of working, as Richard Susskind has been saying, then doing the podcast and speaking with leaders who are saying, yes, no, this change is actually happening. And then COVID and now generative AI to see, look, not everywhere, but in large pockets of the profession, people are starting to do things differently. That was really exciting to me.
It's great. Even just sitting down the File Notes podcast, being able to talk to such a range of people, you just hear perspectives that you haven't even really delved into that world of thinking about that topic before. It's great.
Totally agree.
And so moving to your role now at Minter Ellison, can you share what exactly you do as AI lead?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a relatively new role, but I think it sort of describes a range of activities that not just me, a bunch of people across Minter Ellison have been performing over the last 12 to 18 months as a result of the latest developments in artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI. But to back up just a little bit prior to that, and still today, part of what I do is co-lead our legal optimization consulting practice. So we spun this practice up, Minter spun this practice up about 5 years ago now, to share the best practice knowledge and learnings that Minter Ellison had developed, innovating in our own work in transforming legal processes, implementing technology. There's increasing demand from our clients to understand what it is best practice to run an in-house legal function. So taking the knowledge, principles, lessons learned across people, process, and technology, and bringing that from a law firm context to an in-house legal context. And that has been the majority of what I've done for a lot of my career. And also that was my main role when I joined Minter Ellison, our legal optimization consulting practice. Our clients were increasingly coming to us and saying, look, yes, we want to improve our efficiency. We want to leverage technology. We want to better engage our people. And generative AI seems to be the best way to do that. And so a good chunk of the queries and interest from our clients around legal optimization consulting were sort of being funneled into generative AI. How can we use generative AI? As a result of that, I sort of directed more and more of my time and energy, and the firm has supported that with resourcing and time towards answering those questions. How can clients better manage people, improve their processes, and uplift technology using generative AI? Hence sort of the shift towards more and more focus in that space.
When we've spoke previously, you have mentioned that you're not an expert on AI, but you understand legal functions and legal technology. Do you think that this is going to be a more and more important place in the legal industry to have people who can translate from the technological side into like the more practical use case side for lawyers every day to understand how AI might be used?
I do. I'd like to preface this by saying I'm a cautious AI optimist. And what I mean by that is I think it's ludicrous to assume that artificial intelligence will completely upend the legal profession, replace the majority of lawyers, and do all of the complex legal reasoning that we currently reserve for highly trained specialized lawyers and silks. That's absolutely not going to happen. But what is already happening, and what is highly likely, is that some significant chunk of legal work will be augmented as a result of this increasingly capable, as a result of our increasingly capable machines. I think it's worth prefacing, we're not talking about the entirety of the legal profession. We're talking about a specific chunk of it. But within that chunk, which is growing quite rapidly, there is a huge need for knowledge, for explanation, and for bridging the gap between technical expertise and the real world of legal practice. And that's the space that I love to play in. We are really fortunate at Minter Ellison to have amazing technical experts who are deep in the process of building new technology and deploying it within our own environments, and increasingly looking for opportunities to do that with our clients as well. But it is very complicated. It is very technical. And it's not quite the case that the majority of generative AI applications are just plug and play. Not everything looks like ChatGPT, where you can immediately see, wow, this is a really powerful technology. Instead, a lot of automation and generative AI in practice is quite complicated. It's technical. And so it does require both technical experts and people who can bridge the gap, which means legal expertise and business professional expertise as well. That's a really complicated thing to do, to be able to say, look, we know for this particular area of law, we take these steps. And of these 15 steps, I think this particular step number 3 and 4, is really suitable for generative AI, but other steps in the process are not. So like, let's say contract negotiations, right? Is generative AI going to be able to do every single step in contract negotiations? Of course not. But might it be able to explain particular clauses in plain English or suggest rewrites based on a library of precedents? Potentially that's a great use case. And so one of the skills that we really need at the moment, which is highly valuable, is the ability for lawyers to think not just with their legal hats, but with a process hat on to better identify use cases.
For sure. And I guess it kind of comes down to you actually need a strategy with how you're going to approach AI. Because like you mentioned, you can't just throw it out there, apply it to everything, because it won't work out well. You need to be quite specific and intentional. And I guess it also comes down to you have to track what return this investment in the technology is actually giving to you.
Yeah. Again, let's go back to this principle, which is all legal tasks are not suitable for generative AI. And generative AI, as far as we can tell right now, is not going to replace all legal tasks by any means. But let's say it is suitable to augment 30 to 50% of legal tasks. So let's be conservative and say 30%. It's suitable to augment. And that means it will speed up. It might help you do it at higher quality, right? We're actually seeing that for those tasks, for that 30% of tasks that you can augment with generative AI, the productivity gains are really substantial. So some research from Boston Consulting Group and Harvard found that consultants were completing tasks up to 25% faster and at 40% higher quality. These are Boston Consulting Group professionals, very highly trained, very highly skilled, extremely expensive, at the top of their game, and they're experiencing real world productivity benefits from generative AI. How does that translate to the legal world? We haven't got a lot of rigorous research on how generative AI can improve the productivity of legal work, but we're starting to see some early evidence. In law students, one study from Choi and others found that we're seeing similar productivity gains across legal analysis and written work, somewhere in the realm of 25 to 30% faster. And when you look at the CoPilot research, we've deployed CoPilot across Minter Ellison. You're starting to see this in other professional services firms as well. I mean, one statistic that I'm constantly shocked by, Sophie, is that when people say, we ask them, how do you find CoPilot? What are the benefits? About half of users say they are saving 2 to 5 hours a week using CoPilot within Minter Ellison, one of the most popular generative AI tools. That's astounding to me because at this stage, CoPilot isn't even particularly good at legal specific tasks. And yet our lawyers and business professionals are saving 2 to 5 hours a week. So in terms of the productivity gains for those tasks that AI is suitable, the evidence is showing it's really promising.
That's crazy, those statistics, especially when you think about the charge out rate of a lawyer. And if you're getting those 5 hours back every week at a minimum, perhaps with the functionality that already exists, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, again, we've got to keep caveating here because the hype around AI is so extreme. This is not for the majority of legal tasks, but it's also true that we're 18 months removed from GPT-4's release, effectively. And GPT-4, along with Claude from Anthropic, are the frontier models, the foundation large language models that are most capable and are showing the most promise in use cases like legal work. And it's only been 18 months or so since the most capable models of this generation have come out. These are the models that power enterprise tools like CoPilot, and they also power the legal specific tools from providers like Lexis and Thomson Reuters. We're at the very early stages of this journey in terms of the capability of these tools.
I think when you think of the AI landscape as a whole, from my perspective, at least as a layperson, I feel like ChatGPT came out of nowhere all of a sudden. And I think it was partly, there was such a big uptake because it was so easy to use. Like it was designed to be simple and accessible to the everyday person. Do you think this hype will carry on?
No, I don't. And I think we're currently entering a stage of, I don't like the Gartner hype cycle particularly, but their word for it is at the trough of disillusionment. Effectively, we're entering a stage where people have seen the hype around generative AI and they're trying it, and some are not liking it, some are liking it, some are loving it, right? And it's the reality of grappling with a new technology that is still in its experimental phase, but which has been hyped beyond anything that we've seen before. And so I'm already seeing pushback from executives that we speak to about the capability of these tools and the promise for the future. And I think it's right for us to be skeptical. And one of the things that I love about working with lawyers is they tend to bring a heavy dose of skepticism. And so they're unlikely to be fooled by massive hype claims. And they come to these tools looking for, sometimes fortunately or unfortunately, not looking necessarily for ways it can be used, but looking for ways it could go wrong or that it might have faults. And so I think that means we're less likely in legal practice to be sort of swindled, but it also means that it's difficult for new technologies to break through, even where they are useful. So broadly in the market, you're starting to see some disillusionment with generative AI, which I think is good. We need to go through that process before we can actually get to the value. And I think the point I'm making is that in legal practice and in law firms, we might actually get to the other side of that faster because we weren't ever forward in the first place.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. It's like the hype is going to stop, but I feel like the development of the products themselves will continue, and then hopefully they can be in a space or in a place, that can be more heavily adopted and actually used effectively in the legal industry and in other industries.
Absolutely.
So if the hype's not stopping and slowing down, and it's going to become more entrenched into everything that we do, whether this be in the near future or the more distant future, do you have any examples of how this will be done in an effective way, or already done in an effective way by any organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll share, obviously, only information that's publicly available. Although we are having a lot of great conversations and working really closely with our clients, a lot of that is commercially sensitive. So everything that I'm talking about here is publicly available. A few stories that I think illustrate really well where organizations are up to, but also best practice in how to get generative AI moving in your organization. So I'll start with Klarna. Klarna is an international financial services organization. At the start of this year, they launched a customer service chatbot powered by generative AI. In the first month, that chatbot held 2.3 million conversations with customers and is now saving them a $40 million annual run rate in customer service operations. The CEO on an earnings call said that this generative AI powered chatbot is doing the work of 700 employees, which went down quite well with investors, not so much maybe with employees. Microsoft have said that they have turned all of their HR policies into chatbots, another example of chatbots. And so every time an employee internally wants to ask a question about maternity leave cover, for example, they can ask the chatbot, and if the answer isn't in the policy, it can be escalated to a member of their HR team. They ran that experiment, they did the pilot over 12 months, and that saved their HR team in APAC, I believe it was, based on an AFR article, 21,000 hours in 12 months, which is a phenomenal amount of time for the HR team to be recouping. You know, in Australia, we have CBA, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and the other large banks from news reports are really leading the way in terms of their AI implementation. CBA have identified over 50 use cases, with some of them, the early use cases, driving up to 30% productivity gains in things like coding. And TAL, a large insurer in Australia, was in the news earlier this week with similar CoPilot productivity benefits to what we've experienced at Minter Ellison. One of their executives was in the AFR saying that they're using CoPilot to save up to 6 hours per week of work in their early trials of over 6,000 people. So they're getting really positive feedback early from generative AI. There's a few different stories there, but just to quickly pick out a couple of key themes, what we're seeing is that the use cases are quite broad. So a lot of these tools are sort of general productivity tools. And the best way to get the access to the productivity gains is to have horizontal access across the organization. That's what tools like Microsoft Copilot look like. And horizontal access means lots of people in all different business units get access to these Gen AI tools, and they can use them however they want across their different use cases. It might be something as simple as drafting an email or summarizing a news report. That is a big chunk of where the productivity gains are at. And the majority of organizations are getting productivity that way. But some of them are also looking at more specific use cases to say, look, we're going to take it beyond table stakes productivity. We're actually going to automate or augment large streams of work, and that's how we're going to get the benefits. So a couple of stories. It is happening at scale in Australian organizations for sure.
Yeah, that's crazy. And they're great examples because I think that something like a chatbot, it doesn't seem as overwhelming as automating a whole process. It's scary and you don't know if it's going to work, or it's just a lot more risky. So seeing that it can work for just a chatbot and save that much time and cost of employing people, and they can spend their time doing work that can further progress the business.
Totally. Yeah, and my clients are in-house legal teams. So that's the context that I think of in particular. What are in-house lawyers using this for? A couple more examples. So Moderna, they have a partnership with OpenAI, and their chief legal officer has been doing a range of media. There's some really great interviews with her that I recommend watching. But as part of their partnership with OpenAI, Moderna built 750 custom GPTs in 8 weeks. So a custom GPT is like a custom chat that has a specific piece of information you've fed it. Maybe it's a PDF or a policy, and it draws from that policy to have interactions with customers or with internal business users. Some of the use cases that they focused on were research summaries. So for their research teams within Moderna, obviously a large pharmaceutical company, huge amounts of research. Can we get better research summaries for those who are on the front lines developing new products or conducting research? Another was a contract simplification tool. So for their commercial team members, including for their procurement team, could they use this to, when third-party terms and conditions come in, help business users sort of understand them, simplify, explain them in an easy-to-understand way? And so they're use cases that the legal team directly benefited from. And that Microsoft HR policy bot example, you could easily see an analogy for that with the in-house legal team as well, right? We've got our FAQs, we've got our sort of the questions that our business users commonly ask us, what's our ABN, or really simple things around sort of marketing commissions, for example. You could turn those things into a custom chatbot pretty easily. And in fact, this is already happening. Most large legal teams in Australia are experimenting with something like that at the moment.
That's awesome. It's so exciting. Yeah. And if a law firm they listen to this podcast and they wanted to get started, where is the first place that they could start, the most simple point of entry?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not a expert in law firm, so I'm external facing. We work with in-house legal teams, but drawing on what we're seeing with in-house legal teams and what we've seen within Minter Ellison, I think there's a couple of steps that have worked really well for us. The first is Minter's has taken a people-led approach to generative AI. Our AI strategy is not an IT strategy. And I think it's really important to get that right. It sounds a bit trite and it sounds a bit businessy, but it can't be understated. The whole value of this technology is in getting people to use it and experiment with it. And there is no benefit if you don't have that. And so creating a culture around experimentation is really critical. A couple of initiatives that we implemented that really helped with building culture. One was dedicated Gen AI time. So we had 1 hour in everyone's calendars per week for 12 weeks. And during that hour, you had a link and you could click through, and there was a curated list of learning and courses, some of them developed by Minter Ellison staff, including myself, including our wonderful digital team, some of them from external sources like LinkedIn Learning, for example. And you could undertake training during that 1 hour. Everyone in the firm had that in their calendar. And you could also take that time to just experiment. We had a walled-in version of ChatGPT. We had access to CoPilot for some people. That could be your experimentation time. But it didn't stop there. The most important part of that policy was that lawyers got fee relief. So instead of stressing about learning about AI on top of your existing billable targets, that 1 hour per week would actually count to your billable targets. And that has been absolutely critical to encouraging experimentation and innovation. As an example of a people-led approach, there's obviously other aspects to it, but I can't emphasize enough how important that is. And we're seeing that for in-house legal teams as well. An example for them is we're seeing a lot of in-house legal teams partner with firms like us to implement really structured training for their employees around how to use AI, what the use cases are, and how to get the most benefit. So a people-led approach, I think, is the first step.
I think what you said about having the hours still be billable hours, I feel like that demonstrates Minter Ellison as a leader in this space, because a lot of firms might do what is great and put an hour in that can be dedicated to learning this, but it will just be put to the back burner if lawyers feel like it's detrimental to their billable hours. So it's definitely a good best practice to follow. It's awesome to hear.
That's right. Yeah, and there's plenty of anxiety about generative AI across the spectrum that, we try to tackle head on as well. There's some people that worry, potentially could this replace our jobs? And I think the easiest way to see that's not true, especially for our lawyers, is for them to try it and see it's clearly quite flawed. It augments rather than automates. It supports you rather than replaces you. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's probably some anxiety as well around, I don't think this is particularly useful for the work that I do. And that's fair as well. I empathize with those people who maybe, lone wolves, they work on their own. They don't particularly like delegating. They're maybe not technology users either. And so there's a lot of people across the spectrum that we have to bring along on the journey and understand that people have very different approaches to technology, especially new tech.
We've spoken about all the great benefits of generative AI, but there's also big risks, which we've slightly touched on. Kind of segueing, I know that you also studied philosophy, and that would have included studying ethics. Do you think that has influenced your approach to generative AI or how you think about it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. That's actually, part of what has driven my interest in it for a while. So yeah, I studied philosophy back, a long time ago, 2011. And one of the courses that I did involved writing essays around sort of AI and automated decision-making. Like a lot of people, I was really influenced by a book called Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, which came out around 2013, 2014. And that was one of the first books to talk about what it would mean if we had AI in policy, controlled by governments, how we could navigate superintelligence responsibly, and what the implications might mean for society. And so I've been thinking, on and off about some of these issues for a long time. And there is a really rich discourse happening right now around how we regulate AI, how we implement it safely, what are some of the ethical considerations that we have to keep in mind when we're using these tools. And this area is fraught with really problematic issues that I think a lot of businesses are grappling with daily, and which bring up hard questions as we are going through the implementation of generative AI, even something as simple as Microsoft CoPilot. And this is especially true because the current landscape of generative AI is actually quite limited. Most AI applications are relying on a small number of foundation models, whether it's GPT-4 from OpenAI or Anthropic's Claude. Most of the development that is happening is being built on top of those models. And yet the fundamental problem is those models lack transparency. We're not able to see the data on which those models were trained. It's very difficult to get a sense of what sort of fairness, bias, transparency implications are around those models, because they're currently held really in secret by these large developers. And so the issues are not just sort of evolving rapidly, but they're pervasive across all the tools that we use.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you kind of start thinking about what information is available to you about it. And when you think of like the name OpenAI, you kind of are under the assumption, oh, they're such a great company, it's free to use, it's all out there and in the open. But the more you learn about it, the more you realize it might not be as open as you think.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And, there are these, as a result of that, there are sort of these inherent challenges that come with using these generative AI tools. And so given that, we sort of have a responsibility as organizations who are leveraging generative AI to do so as responsibly as we can, to implement the right governance structures, to have the right principles and ethical guardrails in place. And we're seeing a lot of momentum and energy around that at the moment, particularly in those organizations that are maybe a little bit further ahead in their journey of implementing AI. It's also true in areas that are highly regulated, international organizations where maybe they're subject to the EU's AI Act, are much more conscious about what they need to do to implement AI responsibly, whether that's have different protections for different use cases and identifying which use cases might be high risk or low risk. We're starting to see that type of approach is likely going to be happening in Australian organisations as well.
So when we think about the top risks associated with generative AI, what are the ones that scream out at you first?
Well, the biggest one that most executives are worried about is reputational. So a couple of stories to illustrate that. Pack and Save, you might know Pack and Save, given New Zealand, and you're probably aware of this story. They, early in the piece, it must have been in 2023, put out a chatbot. And the chatbot allowed you to put in what ingredients you had in your cupboard, and it would generate recipes for you, suggesting what you could use. And some of the recipes went completely off the rails. I think one of them suggested that you could make chlorine gas spaghetti based on what was in your freezer, in your cupboard. Another one had poison bread sandwiches and mosquito repellent roast potatoes. And so the app was meant to be a way to sort of improve customer engagement, right? And give them creative meal plan ideas. but they didn't obviously have enough protections and controls in place around this app, or tested enough before they put it out into the market, that it resulted in a really big reputational issue for them. And we've seen similar issues in the Air Canada case, for example. Jake Moffat sought information about Air Canada's bereavement fares via their website chatbot, but it provided incorrect information about his eligibility for reduced fares. And so relying on that information from the chatbot, this man booked a flight and later applied for a refund, which was then denied. So he'd been getting conflicting information from this chatbot, which was meant to be drawn from policy. And so he brought a case in misrepresentation, and the court found him liable. And so we've got this really interesting situation here where, yes, these chatbots present unique ways for us to engage with our customers, for organizations to engage with their customers, but they're also quite unpredictable. And if we don't have the right governance structures and the risk controls in place, they can lead to results that, as we've seen in those two cases, not favorable at all.
So how does a company kind of mitigate that and make sure that they have these measures in place to be able to make sure that they're not coming up with gasoline spaghetti recipes?
Yeah, I think the first step is to just keep in mind one of the points we made earlier, that this is still a really new and experimental technology. I think but for ChatGPT, which enabled us to have really easy access to large language models, we probably wouldn't have such high expectations for implementing such a new and experimental technology into our operations right away. And so I think it's a strange word to apply to machines, but one of my friends, an expert at Minter's, Jack Sturman, often says we need to approach AI with empathy. We actually need to have empathy for the fact that this is a new and experimental technology, and perhaps thinking that way means that we might rethink some of the use cases that we implement. I think most organizations, especially those who are starting to experiment, are more focused on internal productivity. That's where a lot of the benefits are. And I think that's where there are slightly less risks in terms of chatbots going off the rails and making news headlines, right? If we're focused on writing emails a little bit faster and drafting documents a little bit faster, that's less likely that we're going to make the headlines. But beyond that, there are a lot of structures that the larger organizations, leading organizations, are standing up to actually implement AI governance and responsible AI. And some of it can be as simple as, look, do we have somebody on the board who has oversight and accountability for our AI initiatives? That having just that level of corporate governance where there's a focus at the board level on doing AI responsibly is now considered best practice. And so that's a move that a lot of organizations are taking. Below the board level, obviously having an AI governance council or an AI committee is an increasingly common practice in organizations that are experimenting, so that there is some process for reviewing use cases and approving them and making sure that there are the right governance structures in place when they are implemented. So there are two examples, but there's plenty around having sort of oversight and accountability to make sure that the right use cases are chosen, and that when they are chosen, there's some structure around how we protect our users and our people.
And I guess if the best practice now is to have someone on a board that can kind of govern in the area of using generative AI, is there an issue there with that boards, the average age of boards? It's very high. It's a very generational divide kind of piece of technology. Do you think it's hard to find people to fill those roles on those boards if that's going to be best practice?
I think one of the interesting things about Gen AI is that it's not always the younger people who are getting on board and being engaged with it. We tend to expect that the younger generations who have come up, with iPhones will be more likely to embrace new technology, but research shows that's not always the case. And in fact, some of our executives and our senior lawyers are actually the ones who are most power users of generative AI. I don't want to disclose it, but I know that there are a couple of really top senior people within Minter Ellison. You would never imagine that they were our AI power users. You would never believe it, but they absolutely are. So I think that's really interesting. But it's a tangent. I totally get the point that you're saying, which is a lot of boards feel that they are unprepared to address AI risk. There's some research from the UTS Human Technology Institute and the Australian Institute of Company Directors, which shows that less than half of boards feel prepared to address AI risks. And the majority of them don't have somebody with specific AI expertise on the board. And of course, that's probably going to be the case for many boards because having AI experts, they're in high demand. They're very hard to get right now. I don't think you need to have somebody who's built a machine learning application on the board to have good AI governance. I think rather what we're seeing a lot of is external advisory. People inviting, our Minter Ellison partners, for example, to come in and advise on AI risks, to conduct training and workshops to help the board upskill as a whole and be more prepared to address those risks. And some of it's about knowledge, and the rest of it's about sort of controls and procedures, having the right policies in place, operationalizing it, having communication across different silos in the organization. I know some of that sounds like buzzwords, but in reality, it is about having something documented and having people talk to each other at the end of the day that matters the most.
Yeah. And so we've spoken about the things you can put in place to kind of mitigate some of these risks. Speaking about the risks themselves a bit more, there's issues like bias that can come up. Can you elaborate on this issue with respect to generative AI?
Yeah, I mean, bias is a particularly pernicious one. As we've talked about, we don't know what the training data is for a lot of these large language models. There's some indication, but it's not clear exactly what type of data to the full extent that they were trained on. And that means it's difficult to interrogate whether or not that data is biased. In addition, when they're placed in new environments and given, for example, proprietary information, it can be difficult to understand how they'll interact with that and whether or not that might lead to biased outputs. So we have a problem on both ends. We might have biased inputs in the training data. We might have biased outputs in what the model actually generates. And so again, this is an ongoing issue that requires sort of controls, security, monitoring to manage. The most interesting to me issue around generative AI, though, Sophie, is something called shadow IT. This isn't a phrase that I came up with. It's around there. And it's basically this idea that many people are using AI tools unsupervised. And I'll just give you a couple of statistics to put that in perspective. So about a third of Australian organisations have now implemented some type of generative AI. So a third of Australian organisations, they've given that access to their employees. Probably not all employees have access to it, but 75% of employees say that they are using generative AI at work. So you have this massive gap between where organisations have given employees permission and access to AI and the number of employees who are actually using it. So that means that even if your employees don't have access to AI, they're probably using it anyway. And if they're using it anyway, that means they're using it in a way that is unsupervised and unmanaged and difficult to control. And that leads to specific risks, like what if they put proprietary information into these publicly available chatbots? That's obviously a risk that we want to avoid. But also more complicated ones like, how do we make sure that people are doing the work? How do we make sure that they are taking ownership over what they produce? How do we make sure there's a human in the loop? You really can't do that if people are using an external tool that is not mandated by your organization. So this concept of shadow IT is one of the key issues that we have at the moment. And it's a really difficult one to manage because you obviously can't have 100% of Australian organizations implementing generative AI right now. And so it becomes a cultural one. How can we educate our people and get them engaged with potential risks like bias that we just talked about so they understand that it's important to use AI in a safe and managed way?
I think that's difficult on that point as well, because if you have all these people who have been using AI without their employer knowing, they've probably got pretty used to using it for their work. And then if you take that away, they're not going to be very happy because they've become so accustomed to using this new tool.
Yeah, like you're not able to control it. You're also, I think the other issue is you're not able to reward them when they are doing things well. Like what we actually want is for people to identify where we can cut out unnecessary work using AI. And if they're doing it in an unsupervised way, right, they're doing it off the side of their desk, they have no incentive to tell you, right? Their incentive is to do it as fast as possible and then either relax the rest of the day or, depending on how they're inclined, go and do extra work that they're more interested in. But we need to create this incentive of sharing where this works. And the only way to do that is to have it done in sort of a structured and supervised way.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big gap of how and when to do this for all the businesses out there, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Sam. We've covered so much today, from your career story, the range of careers that is out there in the legal industry that might not be practicing law itself. We've covered the AI landscape, what tools are out there, and of course the risks that are involved in that. To wrap up the episode, I have 3 quick-fire questions for you.
Okay.
First one, what is your favorite application of AI in legal tech?
Well, look, I'm a bit boring in that my favorite tool to use at the moment is Anthropic's Claude. And they've recently released Sonnet 3.5, which is their most capable model. And the reason why I think that's my favorite tool, even in legal context or in consulting context, is that it has the most human-like natural language. I don't have a benchmark score to give you that shows that it does this, but it is the tool that you interact with the most, that you feel less like a robot. It feels less clunky. It feels less inorganic. It feels like you are really getting the writing of someone else. And one of the things I particularly love about Claude Sonnet is it's an excellent mimic. I can give it a piece of text that I've written and ask it to improve it or write something else in the style of my own writing. And it does a pretty good job of it. Of course, it's not perfect. Of course, you need to review it and edit it, but it's very good. And that's by far my favorite application.
And then the next question was, what is your favorite application of AI in a personal context? So it might be the same, unless you have another one.
Well, it's a little bit different because I've got 3 little kids and they love stories. And one of the things we've been doing is using ChatGPT to create stories. My son's stories, no offense, Ollie, if you ever listen to this, but they can be a little bit boring and a little bit repetitive. It's often about monsters or large animals fighting, and they're often in a jungle. And you can give that prompt to ChatGPT and tell it to write a story, and it fleshes it out and makes it interesting, puts it in different formats. But the best bit is we then take that and ask it to create images. And so create an image of this story, create an image of a blue dragon, make its wings bigger, make it more scary, make it breathe fire. And all of a sudden, we've taken sort of a really simple idea for a story and turned it into a much larger narrative landscape for him, and then visualized it in an image. And I really love going through that with him and with my daughter Bella as well. And that's by far my favorite sort of non-work or personal use of AI.
Yeah, that's awesome. I haven't heard of it used in that context. And final question, if you weren't in the legal industry, what would be your dream job?
I don't know if it counts being in the legal tech industry, but I couldn't really imagine myself doing anything else at the moment. I love what I do. I'm in a really fortunate point in my career where my personal interests around AI and technology and doing things differently align really well with what I'm doing right now. And I love my work and sort of happy to work as much as it takes to get this up and running because it's a really exciting time. So to answer your question, Sibyl, I can't imagine doing anything else.
I love it. Thank you so much, Sam. If people would like to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Well, look, I try to be as active as I can on LinkedIn, usually post once or twice a week. You can jump on there, but I'm not super good at responding to emails, or LinkedIn messages. But I promise I'll make an effort. So that's probably the best way to get in touch.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam.
No worries. Good to chat with you.